Aliyah Thompson rolled her wheelchair through Westfield Preparatory Academy's marble hallways, 8 months into recovery from the car accident that had changed everything. As the only black scholarship student in the elite, predominantly white school, she'd expected stares but not the calculated cruelty that followed. When Brandon Mitchell and his wealthy friends cornered her in the empty gymnasium, they yanked her from the chair and left her helpless on the polished floor while they rode around in circles, thinking their trust funds made them untouchable. But what Brandon didn't know was that before her accident, Aliyah had been a martial arts prodigy, trained by her father, a former Marine combat instructor. And soon the entitled bullies would learn a very painful and costly lesson. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine campus of Westfield Preparatory Academy, its golden rays illuminating manicured lawns that cost more to maintain than most families earned in a year. Aliyah Thompson navigated her wheelchair along the cobblestone pathways, the gentle hum of rubber wheels against stone, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 2 months. At 16, Aliyah possessed the kind of quiet dignity that made people take notice. Sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, a posture that remained proud despite her circumstances, and an inner strength that radiated from her like heat from a flame. Her scholarship letter had been a miracle, a lifeline that pulled her family from the public school system into the rarefied air of New England's most exclusive preparatory academy. But miracles, Aliyah was learning, often came with hidden costs. "Watch out, everyone," a voice called out across the courtyard, dripping with false concern. "Charity case coming through." Brandon Mitchell emerged from behind one of the academy's signature oak trees, his perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light. At 17, he embodied everything Westfield Preparatory promised its donors: athletic excellence, academic achievement, and the unshakable confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged somewhere. His Patagonia jacket probably cost more than Aliyah's mother made in a month cleaning office buildings. 2 other boys flanked him like loyal lieutenants: Chase Worthington, whose great-grandfather's name graced the library, and Parker Hayes, whose father owned half the real estate in downtown Boston. Together they formed the unofficial aristocracy of Westfield's junior class, untouchable, unaccountable, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. "I heard they had to install special ramps just for you," Chase added, his tone carrying the casual cruelty that only came from a lifetime of consequence-free behavior. "Must be nice having the whole school redesigned around your needs." Aliyah's hands tightened imperceptibly on her wheelchair's handles, but her expression remained serene. She'd learned early in her time at Westfield that reactions were currency here. The more you gave them, the richer they became. "The ramps were already here," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who'd been through far worse than teenage posturing. "ADA compliance isn't exactly revolutionary." Brandon's smirk widened. There was something predatory in his expression, the look of someone who enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill. "Right, of course. I forgot how well-educated you scholarship kids are about regulations." The word scholarship fell from his lips like a slur loaded with implications about charity, inadequacy, and temporary presence. It was a reminder that no matter how well she performed academically, no matter how gracefully she carried herself, she would always be the girl who didn't belong. Parker stepped forward, positioning himself directly in Aliyah's path with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never had to consider accessibility. "You know, I've been wondering, do you actually need that thing, or is it just part of the whole sympathy package?" The question hung in the air like poison, designed to wound regardless of how she answered. If she defended her disability, she'd be playing victim. If she ignored it, they'd interpret silence as admission of fraud. "I've been wondering something too," Aliyah said, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Do you actually need to travel in a pack, or is it just harder to be cruel when you're alone?" The courtyard fell silent. Other students had begun to gather, drawn by the familiar scent of social blood in the water. Some watched with obvious discomfort, but none moved to intervene. At Westfield, survival meant avoiding the attention of predators, even when they fed on someone else. Brandon's face flushed red beneath his tan. For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Not just embarrassment, but genuine rage at being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. "Careful, Aliyah," he said, her name twisting in his mouth like a foreign word. "You might want to remember that some of us have been here a lot longer than 2 months. We know how things work." As the trio walked away, their laughter echoing off the academy's historic brick walls, Aaliyah felt the familiar burn of controlled fury in her chest. But beneath the anger was something else, a cold, calculating determination that reminded her of the mindset she'd cultivated during years of martial arts training. They thought they knew her story. They thought they understood her limitations. They had no idea what she was capable of. The accident played in Aaliyah's mind sometimes when she least expected it, usually during the quiet moments between sleep and waking, when her defenses were down and memory could slip past her careful control. 8 months ago, she'd been a different person entirely. Aaliyah Thompson, 3-time state champion in mixed martial arts, destined for a full scholarship to any university that would have her, invincible in the way that only teenagers who'd never truly lost could be. The semi-truck had run a red light at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in March. One moment she'd been walking home from practice, earbuds in, reviewing the combinations she'd drilled that day. The next, she was waking up in Massachusetts General Hospital, with her mother's tear-streaked face hovering over her, and a doctor explaining words like spinal compression and extensive rehabilitation with the kind of clinical detachment that made tragedy sound like homework. "Your progress has been remarkable," Dr. Martinez had said during her last appointment, reviewing charts that documented 8 months of grueling physical therapy. "Most patients with this type of injury don't regain this level of function. Your muscle memory from martial arts training has been a significant factor in your recovery." What the good doctor didn't know, what nobody knew except Aaliyah and her father, was exactly how much function she'd regained. The wheelchair had become both necessity and camouflage, required for longer distances and demanding days, but no longer the absolute limitation everyone assumed it to be. The Thompson family's 2-bedroom apartment sat in a part of Cambridge that Westfield preparatory students would never see, unless they were slumming for some kind of social media story about real people. Aaliyah's mother, Carmen, worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat: cleaning office buildings at night, stocking shelves at a grocery store on weekends, and, most relevant to Aaliyah's current situation, maintaining the pristine floors and surfaces of Westfield Preparatory Academy every evening, after the last privileged teenager had departed. "How was school today, Mika?" Carmen asked as Aaliyah transferred from her wheelchair to their worn couch. Her mother looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from holding a family together through sheer force of will. "The usual," Aaliyah replied, not wanting to add to her mother's burdens. Carmen had sacrificed too much already, working extra shifts to pay for the physical therapy insurance wouldn't cover, sleeping 4 hours a night so she could be present for every doctor's appointment. Her father's voice crackled through the phone speaker, the connection weak from whatever forward operating base he was currently stationed at. Staff Sergeant Miguel Thompson had been deployed when the accident happened, and the Marine Corps had granted him emergency leave for 2 weeks before sending him back to finish his tour. The guilt in his voice during their weekly calls was palpable, a father's anguish at being unable to protect his daughter when she needed him most. "How's the physical therapy going?" he asked, and Aaliyah could hear the hope buried beneath his careful neutrality. "Good, Dad, really good." She caught her mother's eye and saw understanding pass between them. Carmen knew her daughter was pushing herself harder than the doctors recommended, knew about the late-night sessions where Aaliyah worked through martial arts forms adapted for her current abilities. "Your sensei called me," Miguel continued. "Said he wanted to restart training when I get home. Modified techniques, but still the real thing." Aaliyah's heart jumped. Sensei Richardson had been her first and most important teacher, the man who'd taken a skinny 12-year-old with anger issues and molded her into a disciplined warrior. If he thought she was ready to return to training. "When do you come home?" she asked. 6 weeks, and Aaliyah," his voice grew serious. "I know you're dealing with more than you're telling me. Kids at that fancy school giving you trouble?" Aaliyah looked around their modest apartment, at her mother's uniform hanging by the door, at the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, at the photo of her father in dress blues on the mantel. Her family had sacrificed everything to give her this opportunity. She wouldn't let Brandon Mitchell and his privileged cronies take it away. "Nothing I can't handle, Dad. That's my girl. Remember what I taught you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to act." As the call ended, Aaliyah transferred back to her wheelchair and made her way to the small space they'd converted into a therapy area. Her movements were careful, controlled, but there was something in her posture that hadn't been there months ago. A coiled energy, like a spring compressed and waiting for release. Brandon thought he knew her story. He thought he understood her limitations. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. The harassment at Westfield Preparatory Academy was nothing if not sophisticated. Brandon Mitchell and his crew had elevated teenage cruelty to an art form, employing psychological warfare tactics that left no visible bruises and few witnesses willing to testify. They understood instinctively that the most effective torture was the kind that could be dismissed as misunderstanding, teenage thoughtlessness, or simple social dynamics. It started with the strategically dropped backpack that appeared in Aaliyah's path just as she rounded corners. Parker Hayes had perfected this maneuver, timing his accident so perfectly that by the time Aaliyah had to stop and navigate around the obstacle, he was already retrieving it with exaggerated apologies and a smirk that made his true intentions clear. "Oh, wow, sorry about that," he'd say, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "These things just have a mind of their own, you know how it is." But Aaliyah knew exactly how it was. The backpack incidents happened 3 times a week, always in high-traffic areas where maximum inconvenience could be achieved. Other students would have to squeeze around her stopped wheelchair, creating a bottleneck that made her presence feel like a burden rather than a right. The comments were worse than the obstacles. Chase Worthington had developed a particular talent for the aside meant to be overheard, conversations conducted at exactly the volume needed to reach Aaliyah's ears while maintaining plausible deniability. "I heard they had to lower the academic standards to meet diversity quotas," he'd murmur to Brandon, as Aaliyah passed their lunch table. "Kind of unfair to the kids who earned their spots the traditional way." "Well, you know how it is with these special circumstances admissions," Brandon would reply, his voice carrying just the right note of false sympathy. "The administration has to check all their boxes." The psychological precision was masterful. They never said anything directly actionable, never crossed lines that would trigger administrative intervention. Instead, they created a constant drip of invalidation, each comment designed to reinforce the message that she didn't belong, hadn't earned her place, and existed at Westfield only as a token gesture toward inclusivity. The worst part was watching other students pretend not to notice. Aaliyah understood their reluctance to intervene. At Westfield, social survival meant avoiding the attention of predators even when they fed on someone else. But the silence felt like complicity, a collective decision that her dignity was an acceptable sacrifice for everyone else's comfort. During AP Chemistry, Professor Williams, no relation despite sharing Aaliyah's last name, assigned lab partners for the semester's major project. When Brandon discovered he'd been paired with Marcus Chen, the class valedictorian, he made sure his disappointment was audible. "Guess I'll actually have to work for my grade this semester," he announced to the class. Unlike some people who get curve adjustments built into their transcripts, every eye in the classroom found Aaliyah, the implication crystal clear. She was the some people who supposedly received special treatment, academic charity disguised as equality. The accusation was particularly galling because her grades were exceptional, 4.0 GPA maintained, despite missing weeks of school for medical appointments and physical therapy. Professor Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing. Like most of the faculty, he seemed to operate under the assumption that teenage social dynamics were beyond adult intervention, that somehow adolescents would naturally develop empathy and restraint without guidance or consequences. The breaking point came during lunch on a Friday afternoon. Aaliyah had found a quiet table near the windows, trying to review calculus notes while eating her sandwich. The cafeteria was bustling with its usual energy, the controlled chaos of 300 teenagers navigating social hierarchies more complex than most corporate structures. That's when Brandon's voice cut through the din, loud enough to carry across multiple tables. "I'm just saying, if I wanted to get into Harvard, maybe I should get myself a wheelchair and a good sob story. Seems like that's worth about 200 points on your SATs these days." The cafeteria didn't fall silent. That would have been too dramatic, too obvious. Instead, it shifted. Conversations became quieter, more furtive. Students shot glances between Brandon's table and Aaliyah's, waiting to see how this latest provocation would play out. Aaliyah set down her sandwich carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she looked up, her eyes found Brandon's across the crowded room. For a moment, something passed between them. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He was pushing boundaries, testing limits, seeing how far he could go before she broke. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't breaking. She was hardening, like steel tempered in fire. The real question wasn't whether she would respond. The question was when and how, and whether Brandon would be ready for what he'd awakened. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the New England autumn had painted Westfield Preparatory's campus in shades of gold and crimson that belonged on postcards advertising privilege. Aaliyah had stayed late to work on her senior thesis proposal in the library, the marble-floored sanctuary, where whispered conversations echoed like prayers and knowledge felt almost sacred. She was making her way across the main corridor toward the accessible exit when she heard the unmistakable sound of expensive sneakers squeaking against polished stone. Brandon Mitchell appeared from behind one of the massive columns that supported the academy's vaulted ceiling, flanked as always by Chase and Parker. But something was different this time. There was an electric tension in their movements, a predatory excitement that made Aaliyah's skin prickle with warning. "Well, well," Brandon said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Working late again? Don't you have a bus to catch back to whatever neighborhood scholarship kids come from?" The building was nearly empty. Aaliyah realized with growing unease that the usual buffers were gone. No teachers grading papers in their offices, no other students to serve as witnesses, no janitors, including her mother, who wouldn't arrive for another hour. She was alone with 3 boys who'd been escalating their harassment for weeks. "The library doesn't close for another hour," she replied evenly, continuing toward the exit. But Chase moved to block her path while Parker circled around behind her, their formation suggesting practiced coordination. "See, that's what I don't understand about you," Brandon continued, stepping closer. "You act like you have every right to be here, like you earned your spot through merit instead of checking boxes on some diversity checklist." Aaliyah's hands tightened on her wheelchair's handles. She'd been through enough physical therapy to recognize the signs of her own body preparing for conflict. Elevated heart rate, heightened awareness, the subtle shift in muscle tension that preceded either fight or flight. "I scored higher on my entrance exams than any of you," she said quietly. "My grades speak for themselves." "Your grades," Parker laughed from behind her, "speak to how much help you're getting. Tutors, extra time, modified expectations. Must be nice having everyone bend over backward to make sure you succeed." Brandon dropped to one knee, bringing himself to Aaliyah's eye level with mock sincerity. "You know what I think? I think you're playing victim when it suits you and hero when it doesn't. I think this whole wheelchair thing is just another way to game the system." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Of all the lies they could have chosen, this one cut deepest because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Her recovery had progressed further than anyone knew, but the implication that she was faking her disability was both medically absurd and personally devastating. "You think I'm faking this?" Aaliyah's voice remained steady, but something cold had entered her tone. "You think I chose to spend 8 months relearning how to exist in the world?" "I think," Brandon said, standing up and placing his hand on her wheelchair, "that convenient disabilities can open convenient doors. And I think maybe it's time someone called you out on your bullshit." Before Aaliyah could react, Brandon grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and yanked it backward hard. The sudden movement sent her sliding forward in the seat, off balance and vulnerable. Chase and Parker moved in immediately, their hands reaching for her arms as if to help her back into position. "Careful there," Chase said with false concern. "Wouldn't want you to have another accident." The word "another" was loaded with implication, a reminder that accidents happen to people like her, that vulnerability was her natural state, that she existed at their mercy. That's when something fundamental shifted inside Aaliyah Thompson. The careful patience she'd maintained, the strategic silence she'd cultivated, the hope that they would eventually tire of their games, all of it burned away in an instant of pure, controlled rage. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to act." The right moment had arrived. Jessica Martinez had been Aaliyah's closest friend since the first week of school, drawn together by their shared status as scholarship students in a sea of inherited wealth. While Aaliyah's admission had been earned through academic excellence, Jessica's artistic talents had secured her place in Westfield's prestigious arts program. They understood each other's struggles in ways that didn't require explanation: the careful budgeting of lunch money, the strategic scheduling around work-study commitments, the constant awareness that they were guests in someone else's world. From her position in the library's upper gallery, Jessica had watched the confrontation unfold with growing alarm. She'd been researching material for her AP Art History presentation when she'd noticed Brandon and his crew positioning themselves near the main exit, their body language suggesting predatory intent. When Aaliyah had emerged from the stacks, Jessica had felt her stomach drop with the sick certainty that something was about to happen. Now crouched behind the gallery's marble balustrade, with her phone already recording, Jessica watched Brandon yank Aaliyah's wheelchair backward. The casual violence of the gesture made her breath catch. This wasn't just verbal harassment anymore. This was physical assault, captured in high definition from an angle that showed everything. "I have to do something," she whispered to herself, but her hands were shaking too badly to be useful. She was one girl against 3 boys who outweighed her significantly in a building that was essentially empty. Any intervention on her part would likely make things worse for both of them, but she could document. She could bear witness. She could make sure that whatever happened next, there would be evidence. 3 floors below in the faculty offices, Mrs. Sarah Chen, Marcus's mother and the Academy's Dean of Students, was reviewing disciplinary files when she heard raised voices echoing through the corridor. The acoustics of Westfield's historic building meant that sound carried in unexpected ways, and something about the tone set off alarm bells in her experienced mind. She'd been at Westfield for 15 years, long enough to recognize the difference between normal teenage conflict and something more serious. The voices she was hearing contained an edge of genuine menace that made her close her laptop and head for the door. Mrs. Chen had been watching the dynamics around Aaliyah Thompson with growing concern. As one of the few faculty members who actually reviewed incident reports, she'd noticed a pattern of accidents and misunderstandings that always seemed to involve the same students. Brandon Mitchell's name appeared with suspicious frequency in situations involving scholarship students, always as a bystander or minor participant, never as an instigator. The administrative response had been frustratingly predictable. Principal Davidson, who relied heavily on donations from families like the Mitchells, preferred to handle such matters through restorative conversations and community building initiatives rather than actual consequences. Mrs. Chen had learned to document everything meticulously, building cases that couldn't be dismissed as teenage drama. Meanwhile, in the parking lot outside, Carmen Thompson was arriving early for her evening shift. The cleaning staff typically began work at 6 p.m., but Carmen often came in an hour early to review the day's maintenance requests and prepare her supplies. As she gathered her equipment from the maintenance shed, she noticed unusual activity in the main building. Lights on in sections that should have been empty, shadows moving past windows that typically remained dark at this hour. Something felt wrong. A mother's instinct, perhaps, or simply the hyper-vigilance that came from working multiple jobs in a world that seemed designed to punish any mistake. Carmen had developed an almost supernatural awareness of potential problems, and every sensor she possessed was currently screaming warnings. She pulled out her phone to call Aaliyah, then hesitated. Her daughter had been increasingly secretive about school, deflecting questions with the kind of practiced evasion that suggested pride was preventing honesty. If Carmen called now, it might feel like checking up, like she didn't trust Aaliyah to handle her own problems. But trust and intuition were at war in her mind, and intuition was winning. Inside the library gallery, Jessica watched Brandon grab Aaliyah's wheelchair and felt something crystallize in her chest. This was the moment that would define everything, not just for Aaliyah, but for everyone who witnessed it. Would they be the people who stood by and watched injustice unfold, or would they be the ones who found the courage to act? She pressed record and prayed that whatever happened next, someone would be held accountable. The dojo had been Aaliyah's sanctuary for 4 years before the accident, a converted warehouse in Somerville, where the walls were lined with mirrors and the air perpetually smelled of sweat, determination, and the rubber matting that cushioned countless falls. Sensei Richardson had been more than a teacher. He'd been the father figure who stepped in when Miguel Thompson deployed overseas, the steady presence who taught her that strength came from discipline, not anger. "Your daughter has exceptional instincts," he'd told Carmen during one of their parent conferences. "But more importantly, she has the temperament for this. Martial arts isn't about learning to fight, it's about learning when not to fight, and how to end conflicts when fighting becomes unavoidable." At 12, Aaliyah had been all sharp edges and barely contained fury, a skinny kid with too much anger and not enough outlets. The divorce had been brutal, the kind of drawn-out custody battle that left casualties in its wake. Her father's deployment had felt like abandonment, even though logically she understood military obligations. Martial arts had given her somewhere to channel the rage, transforming destructive emotion into disciplined power. By 14, she was competing at the state level, her natural athleticism enhanced by an almost supernatural ability to read opponents. She moved like water, flowing around attacks and finding openings that others missed. Her specialty was mixed martial arts with a focus on defensive techniques, using an opponent's strength against them, turning their momentum into her advantage. "Watch," Sensei Richardson had said during one of her final lessons before the accident, as she demonstrated a technique against a much larger opponent. "Aaliyah doesn't fight her opponent's power. She redirects it. The bigger they are, the more energy they give her to work with." The technique was called Aiki, the principle of harmonizing with an attacker's force rather than opposing it directly. It required perfect timing, precise positioning, and absolute confidence in one's ability to turn defense into offense in the span of a heartbeat. Now, 8 months later, Aaliyah sat in her modified home gym, the corner of their living room where Carmen had helped her set up resistance bands, balance equipment, and floor mats. The physical therapy had been grueling, but she'd supplemented it with adapted martial arts forms, working with her father over video calls to modify techniques for her current abilities. "Show me the wheelchair transfer drill," Miguel's voice came through her laptop speaker during one of their weekly sessions. The connection was grainy, military internet being what it was, but his encouragement came through clearly. Aaliyah positioned herself at the edge of her chair, demonstrating the fluid movement she'd perfected over months of practice. To an observer, it would look like a standard physical therapy exercise. To someone who knew martial arts, it was something else entirely, the foundation for techniques that could be devastatingly effective. "Good," Miguel said, pride evident in his voice. "Your balance is better than it was before the accident. All that core work is paying off." "Sensei Richardson called again," Aaliyah mentioned, securing herself back in her wheelchair. "He wants to know when I'll be ready to come back to the dojo." "What did you tell him?" "That I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. Everything's different now." Miguel was quiet for a moment, and Aaliyah could see him choosing his words carefully. "Different doesn't mean weaker, Mija. Sometimes it means you develop strengths you never knew you needed." They worked through modified forms for another hour, movements that looked like stretching and physical therapy, but were actually combat techniques adapted for her current reality. Aaliyah had learned to generate power from her core, to use her wheelchair as both shield and weapon, to turn her apparent vulnerability into tactical advantage. "Remember," Miguel said as they concluded the session, "the best fights are the ones you never have to have, but if someone forces you to fight, you end it quickly and decisively." As she powered down the laptop, Aaliyah caught sight of herself in the mirror. The girl looking back was different from the one who'd walked into traffic 8 months ago. Harder, perhaps, but also more focused. The accident had taken her legs, but it had given her something else. A crystalline clarity about who she was and what she was capable of. Brandon Mitchell thought he knew her story. He thought he understood her limitations. He was about to discover that underestimating Aaliyah Thompson was the biggest mistake of his privileged life. The discovery came on a Wednesday evening when Brandon Mitchell was leaving lacrosse practice. He'd been walking toward the parking lot when he noticed movement in the administrative wing, specifically a custodial cart positioned outside the dean's office. Curiosity drew him closer, and what he saw through the partially open door made him stop dead in his tracks. Carmen Thompson was cleaning the conference room, where the disciplinary committee met, methodically wiping down the mahogany table where decisions about student futures were made. She wore the navy blue uniform of Westfield's maintenance staff, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible in spaces where she didn't belong. "Well, I'll be damned," Brandon muttered to himself, pulling out his phone to record. The cleaning lady is her mother. The revelation hit him like a tactical strike. All this time, he'd been targeting Aliyah for her scholarship status, her disability, her race, but he'd missed the most humiliating detail of all. Her mother literally cleaned up after the very students who tormented her daughter. Every night, Carmen Thompson scrubbed the floors that Brandon and his friends walked on, emptied the trash cans that contained their discarded privilege, maintained the spotless facade of an institution that barely tolerated her family's presence. By Thursday morning, the information had spread through Westfield's social networks like wildfire. Brandon had been strategic in his dissemination, sharing the detail with just enough people to ensure maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability about how the information had spread. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with honest work," Chase said during AP Economics, his voice pitched to carry across the classroom. "I'm just saying it explains a lot about certain people's attitudes. When your mom cleans up other people's messes for a living, you probably develop some resentment." Professor Hartwell frowned but said nothing. Like most of the faculty, he seemed to operate under the assumption that addressing student social dynamics was beyond his purview, that somehow education could occur in a vacuum separate from human dignity. Aliyah sat in the back of the classroom, her expression carefully neutral as she felt every eye in the room find her. The weight of their stares was almost physical, some sympathetic, others curious, most simply uncomfortable with being present for someone else's humiliation. During lunch, the campaign intensified. Parker had positioned himself at the table closest to the service entrance, where kitchen staff brought supplies, timing his comments to coincide with delivery schedules. "I wonder if she gets employee discounts in the cafeteria," he mused loudly. "You know, family benefits and all that. Probably gets the inside scoop on all the faculty gossip too," Brandon added, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect pressure point. "Amazing what people say around the cleaning staff. They probably think she's furniture." The psychological precision was masterful. He wasn't attacking Carmen's work directly. That would have been too obvious, too easily condemned. Instead, he was attacking the dynamic, the power imbalance, the way Aliyah's family was embedded in the school's infrastructure in a position of service rather than equality. "Must be weird," Chase continued, "having your mom clean up after your classmates. Does she ever tell you about the messes we make? The things she finds in our trash?" Aliyah's grip on her water bottle tightened until her knuckles went white. They were trying to make her mother's honest work feel shameful, to transform Carmen's dignity into Aliyah's burden. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, targeting not just her own vulnerability, but her love for her family. That afternoon, as Carmen began her shift in the dormitory wing, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Students were watching her differently, not with the usual indifference of teenagers who'd learned to treat service workers as invisible, but with the cruel attention of predators who'd identified new prey. "That's her," she heard one boy whisper to his friend as she emptied a trash can. "That's the scholarship girl's mom." Carmen Thompson had worked in enough hostile environments to recognize danger when she saw it. Someone had weaponized her presence in her daughter's world, turning her employment into ammunition for psychological warfare. That night, she would have to decide whether to protect her daughter by finding another job, or trust that Aliyah was strong enough to weather whatever storm was coming. The answer would come sooner than either of them expected. The decision crystallized for Aliyah during a conversation with Mrs. Chen that she never should have overheard. She'd been leaving the library after another late study session when she heard raised voices from the dean's office, one belonging to the woman who'd become her quiet advocate, the other to Principal Davidson, whose primary concern seemed to be maintaining donor relationships rather than student welfare. "The harassment is escalating," Mrs. Chen was saying, her usually calm voice tight with frustration. "We have documented incidents, witness statements, and now they're targeting the girl's family. This has moved beyond typical teenage conflict." "Sarah, I understand your concerns," Principal Davidson replied, his tone suggesting he understood nothing of the sort. "But we need to be very careful about how we handle situations involving families like the Mitchells. Brandon's father has been extraordinarily generous to our capital campaign." Aliyah pressed herself against the wall beside the office door, her heart pounding, as she realized they were discussing her situation. Mrs. Chen had been documenting everything, every accident, Every strategic obstacle, every calculated humiliation, someone had been paying attention after all. So we're prioritizing donations over student safety. Mrs. Chen's voice carried a dangerous edge. That's the position we're taking? I'm saying we need to consider all stakeholders. Perhaps we could arrange a mediated discussion between the students, focus on building understanding rather than assigning blame. James, they're targeting a disabled student and her family. This isn't a misunderstanding that can be resolved through dialogue. This is systematic harassment that requires immediate intervention. And what if the girl is exaggerating the situation? What if she's interpreting normal social dynamics through the lens of her own insecurities? The silence that followed was so profound that Aaliyah could hear her own heartbeat. When Mrs. Chen finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. I'm going to pretend you didn't just suggest that a student with a documented disability is fabricating harassment claims. I'm going to assume that you misspoke due to stress, rather than revealing a fundamental failure of leadership that would require board intervention. Aaliyah didn't wait to hear Principal Davidson's response. She'd heard enough to understand that the system wasn't going to save her. Mrs. Chen was fighting the good fight, but she was outnumbered by administrators more concerned with donor relations than student welfare. If change was going to come, it would have to come from Aaliyah herself. That night she called her father for an unscheduled session. I need to know I'm ready, she said without preamble when his face appeared on the laptop screen. Miguel studied his daughter's expression, noting the steel in her eyes that reminded him of Marines preparing for combat. Ready for what, Mija? To stop being a victim. They trained for 2 hours that night, the longest session since her accident. Aaliyah worked through scenarios, combinations, defensive positions adapted for her current reality. Her father watched with the clinical eye of someone who'd trained warriors for 15 years, and what he saw made him both proud and terrified. You're ready, he said finally. More than ready. But remember, end it quickly and decisively, Aaliyah finished. I know, Dad, I remember everything you taught me. As she powered down the laptop, Aaliyah caught sight of herself in the mirror. The girl looking back was no longer the broken victim who'd entered Westfield 2 months ago. She was something harder, more dangerous, a weapon disguised as vulnerability. Brandon Mitchell had spent months sharpening his cruelty, perfecting his psychological warfare, building toward some ultimate humiliation. What he didn't realize was that every attack had made her stronger, every insult had forged her resolve, every day of harassment had prepared her for the moment when she would finally fight back. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow the harassment would escalate to something that crossed the line from psychological to physical. Tomorrow Brandon would discover that he'd been hunting a predator disguised as prey. Friday afternoon arrived with the deceptive calm that often preceded storms. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of weekend freedom, and Westfield Preparatory's campus buzzed with the restless energy of students counting down to dismissal. Aaliyah had navigated the day with unusual serenity, her responses to Brandon's provocations so measured and controlled that even he seemed puzzled by her lack of reaction. The trap was set with military precision. Brandon had spent the week mapping Aaliyah's routines, identifying the moment of maximum vulnerability and minimal witnesses. She always stayed late on Fridays for debate club, which met in the Humanities building until 4:30. By 5 p.m., the campus was essentially deserted except for a skeleton crew of maintenance staff who wouldn't arrive at the main building until 6. The gymnasium provided the perfect venue, isolated, spacious, with security cameras that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for the past week thanks to Chase's older brother, who worked part-time in campus IT. The space was large enough for what Brandon had planned, private enough to avoid interruption, and symbolic enough to send the message he wanted to deliver. Jessica Martinez had noticed the pattern too, but from a different angle. As Aaliyah's closest friend, she'd developed an almost supernatural awareness of danger signs. The way conversations stopped when Aaliyah approached, the predatory energy that surrounded Brandon and his crew, the sense that something was building toward an inevitable explosion. When debate club ended and she saw Aaliyah heading toward the main building alone, every instinct screamed warnings. "I'll walk with you," Jessica offered, but Aaliyah shook her head. "I've got to stop by my locker." "Go ahead, your mom's waiting." It was a lie and they both knew it. Aaliyah's books were already packed, her locker cleaned out for the weekend. But Jessica recognized the look in her friend's eyes, the calm determination of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be dissuaded. "Aaliyah, trust me," Aaliyah said quietly. "Whatever happens, trust that I know what I'm doing." As Jessica reluctantly left through the main entrance, Aaliyah made her way toward the gymnasium. She could have taken any number of other routes, could have avoided the confrontation entirely. Instead, she rolled deliberately into the trap that had been set for her, her movements calm and purposeful. The gymnasium doors were propped open, an invitation that couldn't have been more obvious if it had been written in neon. Brandon's voice echoed from inside, talking to Chase and Parker with the excited energy of predators who'd cornered their prey. "She thinks she's so smart," he was saying, "always with that superior attitude, like she's better than everyone else. Time to remind her what she really is." Aaliyah paused at the threshold, taking in the scene with tactical awareness. 3 boys positioned strategically around the gymnasium's center court. Expensive smartphones positioned to record from multiple angles, the lighting adjusted to cast dramatic shadows. They'd planned this like a production, complete with documentation for maximum humiliation. "Well, well," Brandon called out as she entered. "Look who decided to join us. We were just talking about you." "I'm sure you were," Aaliyah replied, rolling to the center of the gym with deliberate calm. "What can I do for you, Brandon?" "It's more about what we can do for you," Chase said, moving to block the exit. "See, we've been thinking about your situation, and we feel like maybe you haven't been entirely honest with everyone." Parker circled around behind her wheelchair, completing the trap. "Yeah, we think maybe this whole disability thing is just a performance, and we think it's time for the performance to end." Brandon approached with the confident swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get out of that chair, walk around this gym a few times and prove to everyone that you're nothing but a fraud." "And if I don't?" Aaliyah asked, her voice carrying a dangerous calm that none of them recognized. "Then we'll help you out of it," Brandon replied, reaching for her wheelchair handles. The hard way. As his hands closed around the handles, Aaliyah felt time slow to crystalline clarity. This was the moment her father had trained her for, the situation where violence became unavoidable and ending it quickly became survival. Brandon yanked the wheelchair backward with vicious force, sending Aaliyah sliding forward out of the seat. But instead of crashing helplessly to the floor as he'd expected, she controlled her fall, rolling with the momentum in a way that spoke of years of martial arts training. "What the hell?" Chase started, but his words died as Aaliyah slowly, deliberately rose to her feet. The gymnasium fell completely silent, except for the sound of 3 smartphones recording the moment that would change everything. The silence that followed Aaliyah's rise was profound, the kind of absolute quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that minds need time to process what they're witnessing. Brandon, Chase, and Parker stood frozen, their brains struggling to reconcile what they'd believed about her with what was now standing before them. Aaliyah rose with the fluid grace of someone for whom the movement was not miraculous, but merely delayed. There was no trembling, no uncertainty, just the controlled balance of an athlete who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. She brushed dust from her hands with casual precision, her dark eyes never leaving Brandon's increasingly pale face. "You've been faking it," Brandon whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. "This whole time you've been lying to everyone." "I haven't been faking anything," Aaliyah replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd moved beyond fear. "I've been recovering. There's a difference." Chase's phone wavered in his grip as he tried to process the implications. 2 months of harassment, 2 months of targeting someone they believed was helpless, 2 months of psychological warfare against a girl who'd apparently been capable of fighting back the entire time. "You let us—" Parker started, his voice rising with the panicked realization that they'd potentially been filmed committing assault against someone who could defend herself. "I let you reveal exactly who you are," Aaliyah interrupted, taking a step forward that made all 3 boys instinctively step back. "I let you show everyone watching that given enough time and encouragement, you'd escalate from verbal harassment to physical assault." Brandon's face cycled through emotions, confusion, rage, humiliation, and underneath it all the dawning fear of someone who'd just realized they'd gravely miscalculated. "You think you're clever?" he snarled, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You think this changes anything?" You're still the scholarship kid whose mommy cleans our toilets. And you're still the trust fund baby who thinks money makes you untouchable, Aaliyah replied calmly. But here's what's interesting. I've been recording too. She gestured toward the corner of the gymnasium, where she'd positioned her own phone before entering, angled to capture the entire confrontation from a perspective that clearly showed the boy's aggressive positioning and her own defensive posture. Academic dishonesty, conspiracy to commit assault, harassment based on disability status, she continued, her voice taking on the precise cadence of someone who'd researched legal terminology. And that's before we get to the civil rights violations. Chase was backing toward the exit now, his recording abandoned as self-preservation kicked in. Guys, maybe we should... Should what? Brandon snapped, his composure cracking. Run away because little Miss Victim learned to stand up? I don't think so. But even as he spoke, his body language betrayed his uncertainty. Halia wasn't cowering or pleading, or showing any of the responses he'd been conditioned to expect. Instead, she radiated the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. Last chance, she said quietly. Walk away now, and this ends with academic consequences. Stay and you'll discover what 8 months of physical therapy really accomplished. Parker was already moving toward the door, his survival instincts overriding group loyalty. Brandon, come on, this is getting way out of hand. No, Brandon said, his voice rising with desperate fury. She doesn't get to flip this around. She doesn't get to make us look like the bad guys when she's been lying to everyone for months. He charged forward, his movements telegraphed by anger and driven by panic rather than training. To an observer, it might have looked like 3 athletic teenagers overwhelming one girl in a gymnasium. To someone who understood martial arts, it looked like amateurs attacking a professional who'd been waiting patiently for them to make exactly this mistake. Halia shifted her weight slightly, her stance flowing into the defensive position her father had drilled into her muscle memory. The months of adaptation, the hours of modified training, the careful preparation for exactly this scenario, all of it crystallized into perfect clarity. Thank you, she said quietly, as Brandon reached for her. For what? He demanded. For giving me permission to stop being patient. What happened next unfolded with the devastating precision of a chess master executing a strategy that had been planned 20 moves in advance. As Brandon lunged forward, expecting to overpower someone he still fundamentally misunderstood, Aaliyah demonstrated why underestimating her had been the biggest mistake of his privileged life. She didn't fight Brandon's attack. She redirected it. Her father's voice echoed in her memory as she pivoted slightly, using his momentum against him in a textbook application of Aiki principles. Brandon's charge carried him past her, as she stepped aside with fluid grace, extending one leg to catch his ankle in a perfectly timed sweep that sent him sprawling across the gymnasium floor. Physics, she said calmly, as Brandon hit the hardwood with a sound that echoed through the empty space. Force equals mass times acceleration. Your acceleration just became my advantage. Chase rushed in from the side, apparently believing that numbers would overcome skill. But Aaliyah had been training for multiple attackers since she was 14. As he reached for her, she caught his wrist and rotated her body, using his own momentum to send him stumbling into a bank of folded bleachers with a crash that reverberated through the building. 2 down, she observed, her breathing still perfectly controlled despite the physical exertion. Parker hesitated at the edge of the confrontation, finally understanding that they weren't dealing with a helpless victim, but with someone who moved like violence was a language she spoke fluently. His survival instincts were screaming at him to run, but group loyalty and embarrassment kept him frozen in place. Brandon struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. The easy confidence that had carried him through 17 years of consequence-free behavior was crumbling, replaced by the desperate fury of someone whose worldview was being systematically destroyed. You think you're tough, he snarled, blood trickling from a split lip where he'd hit the floor. You think this makes you better than us? I think this makes me honest, Aaliyah replied, her stance flowing into a defensive position that somehow managed to look both relaxed and ready. You've been pretending to be powerful by targeting someone you thought was weak. I've been pretending to be weak while developing real power. Chase had recovered enough to make another attempt, this time trying to tackle her from behind. But Aaliyah had positioned herself to maintain visual awareness of all three attackers, and she sensed his approach before he'd taken 3 steps. She pivoted and drove her elbow back into his solar plexus with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees as he struggled to breathe. "The thing about martial arts," she continued conversationally, as if she wasn't systematically dismantling 3 opponents, "is that it teaches you about real strength versus perceived strength. Real strength comes from discipline, training, and the willingness to endure hardship. Perceived strength comes from inherited advantages and the ability to avoid consequences." Brandon charged again, this time with the wild desperation of someone who'd realized that everything he'd believed about power dynamics was wrong. Aaliyah caught his wild swing, redirected his arm, and used a hip throw that sent him crashing into the gymnasium wall with enough force to rattle the windows. "You want to know the truth about me?" she asked, standing over Brandon as he tried to recover his bearings. "The truth is that the accident didn't make me weak. It made me patient. Physical therapy didn't just rebuild my body. It rebuilt my mind. And months of your harassment didn't break me. It taught me exactly what I was preparing for." Parker finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. We were just what? Having fun? Boys being boys?" Aaliyah's voice carried a cold edge that made all 3 boys flinch. "You were systematically tormenting someone you thought couldn't fight back. You were documenting it for your entertainment. You escalated to physical assault the moment you thought you could get away with it." She gestured toward the phones that had captured everything, their aggressive positioning, their coordinated attack, her measured self-defense. "The only difference between us is that when I had power over you, I used restraint. When you thought you had power over me, you chose cruelty." Brandon struggled to his feet one final time, his movements uncertain and his confidence shattered. For a moment, he looked like what he actually was, a 17-year-old boy who'd been taught that money and status made him untouchable, now facing the reality that some things couldn't be bought or inherited. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Aaliyah replied quietly, "it is." The gymnasium doors burst open with the authority of someone who'd had enough of political maneuvering and administrative cowardice. Mrs. Chen strode into the space with the determined energy of an educator who'd finally decided that protecting students mattered more than protecting her job. Behind her came Jessica Martinez, whose frantic call had brought the dean of students running from her Friday afternoon faculty meeting. "What in God's name?" Mrs. Chen began, then stopped short as she took in the scene before her. 3 boys in various states of dishevelment scattered across the gymnasium floor like discarded toys. One girl standing calmly in the center of it all, completely unharmed and radiating the quiet confidence of someone who'd just proven a point that had been years in the making. "Mrs. Chen," Aaliyah said with perfect composure, as if greeting her at a parent conference rather than in the aftermath of a confrontation. Perfect timing. Brandon scrambled to his feet, his mind racing to construct a narrative that might salvage something from this disaster. Blood from his split lip had stained his expensive polo shirt, and his hair, usually perfectly styled, hung disheveled across his forehead. "She attacked us," he said desperately, gesturing at his friends who were still struggling to recover their bearings. "We were just talking to her, and she went crazy, started hitting people." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from concern to skepticism as she noticed the positioning of multiple phones around the gymnasium, all apparently set to record. This wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. This was something that had been planned, staged, and documented. "Is that so?" she asked with dangerous calm. "Jessica, what did you see when you got here?" Jessica stepped forward, her own phone in hand. "I saw 3 boys surrounding Aaliyah in the middle of the gym. I saw Brandon yank her wheelchair and knock her to the floor, and I recorded what happened next." She held up her device, its screen showing the clear timestamp and high-definition video that captured everything from the moment of assault through Aaliyah's methodical self-defense. "I think, Mrs. Chen said quietly, we need to see all the recordings, every angle, every perspective." Chase and Parker exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing that their plan to document Aaliyah's humiliation had instead created irrefutable evidence of their own criminal behavior. The phones that were supposed to capture her helplessness had instead recorded her systematic dismantling of their assumptions about power and vulnerability. There's been a misunderstanding, Parker said weakly. But Mrs. Chen silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. The only misunderstanding, she replied, is that you three apparently believed you could assault a student on school property without consequences. As she spoke, the sound of additional footsteps echoed from the corridor. Principal Davidson appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as he processed the scene. Behind him came Carmen Thompson, who'd been summoned by Jessica's emergency call, her maintenance uniform a stark reminder of the class dynamics that had made this confrontation inevitable. "Mija," Carmen whispered, rushing toward her daughter with the desperate relief of a mother whose worst fears had nearly been realized. "I'm okay, Mom," Aaliyah said softly, accepting her mother's embrace while maintaining eye contact with Mrs. Chen. Better than okay, actually. Principal Davidson cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find a way to minimize what had obviously been a serious incident. "Now, let's not rush to judgment here. Perhaps we should call the police," Mrs. Chen interrupted, her voice carrying the steel of someone who'd decided that political considerations no longer mattered. "We have multiple recordings of what appears to be conspiracy to commit assault, actual assault, and harassment based on disability status." "That seems extreme," Davidson began, but Mrs. Chen had pulled out her own phone and was already dialing. "What seems extreme," she said as the call connected, "is that it took 8 months and a physical assault for this administration to take student safety seriously." As she spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Brandon felt the last of his confidence evaporate. The phones that were supposed to document his victory had instead captured his downfall. The girl he'd thought was weak had proven to be stronger than all of them combined, and the money that had always protected him from consequences was powerless against video evidence and criminal charges. For the first time in his privileged life, Brandon Mitchell was about to face real accountability, and Aaliyah Thompson was finally free to stand tall. The next 2 hours unfolded with the methodical precision of institutional crisis management, except this time the institution was scrambling to contain damage rather than suppress truth. The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 officers who took one look at the assembled phones, the obvious injuries and the power dynamics at play, and immediately began treating the situation as a criminal matter rather than a school disciplinary issue. Officer Martinez, no relation to Jessica, was a 15-year veteran who'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the patterns of systematic harassment when she encountered them. As she reviewed the video evidence, her expression grew increasingly grim. "This isn't boys being boys," she said to Principal Davidson, whose attempts at damage control were becoming more desperate by the minute. "This is conspiracy to commit assault, captured in high definition from multiple angles." The parents arrived in waves, their responses revealing everything about their characters and priorities. Carmen Thompson came with the quiet dignity of someone who'd always known this day might arrive, her hand finding Aaliyah's shoulder with protective certainty. Jessica's mother, Dr. Martinez, burst through the doors with the fierce energy of someone who'd dropped everything at work to respond to her daughter's emergency call. Brandon's father, Richard Mitchell III, arrived in his Tesla with the entitlement of someone who expected problems to disappear through the application of money and influence. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from country club golf rather than honest labor. His expensive suit, a armor of privilege that had protected his family from consequences for generations. "This is ridiculous," he announced before he'd even assessed the situation. "Boys will be boys. If my son was defending himself against some kind of attack, your son wasn't defending himself," Officer Martinez interrupted, holding up her tablet to show the crystal-clear footage. "Your son was the aggressor in a planned assault against a disabled student." For a moment, Richard Mitchell's composure cracked as he watched his son yank Aaliyah from her wheelchair and attempt to assault her. The evidence was so clear, so unambiguous, that even his practiced ability to rationalize his family's behavior couldn't transform it into something acceptable. "She was faking her disability," Brandon said desperately from where he sat in a plastic chair, an ice pack pressed to his swollen face. "She was lying to everyone." "About what?" Dr. Martinez asked sharply. "She was a neurologist at Mass General, someone who understood spinal injuries better than everyone else in the room combined." About her recovery? About the extent of her current abilities? Neither of those things justifies what you did. Chase's parents arrived, looking like they'd aged years in the 20 minutes since receiving the call. The Worthingtons were old Boston money, the kind of family whose reputation was built on generations of careful public service and philanthropic contribution. The idea of their son being involved in something this ugly was clearly devastating them. "We don't understand," Chase's mother said weakly. "This isn't like him. He's never been violent before." But the video evidence suggested otherwise. Officer Martinez had requested security footage from the past months, and Mrs. Chen had provided incident reports that painted a picture of escalating harassment that had been systematically ignored by school administration. Parker's family was notably absent. His father was apparently unreachable at some business meeting, his mother traveling in Europe. The boy sat alone except for the lawyer who'd arrived within an hour, speaking to no one, while his expensive legal representation worked the phones to limit his exposure. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading beyond the confines of Westfield Preparatory Academy. Jessica's video had been shared with her older sister at Boston University, who'd immediately posted it to social media with context about the months of harassment that had preceded the confrontation. The hashtag #UnderStimatedWarrior was already trending locally, and reporters were beginning to call the school's communications office. Principal Davidson watched his carefully maintained reputation crumbling in real time. The donors he'd worked so hard to protect were about to become liabilities, and the girl he'd dismissed as a troublemaker was emerging as a hero whose story would define his legacy. As the police finished their preliminary investigation and prepared to transport the three boys to juvenile detention, Aaliyah remained remarkably calm. She answered questions with precision, provided her own recordings without hesitation, and declined medical attention with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never been in control of the situation. "How long have you been able to stand?" Officer Martinez asked gently. "About 4 months," Aaliyah replied. "I use the wheelchair for longer distances, and when I'm tired, but my recovery has been more complete than most people knew. Why didn't you defend yourself sooner?" Aaliyah considered the question carefully. "Because defending yourself and fighting are different things. I was waiting for them to cross the line from harassment to assault. Once they did that, everything changed. The legal consequences unfolded with the swift efficiency that only accompanied cases with overwhelming evidence and high public visibility. Within 72 hours, Brandon Mitchell, Chase Worthington, and Parker Hayes were facing criminal charges that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The crystal-clear video evidence had eliminated any possibility of plea bargaining down to lesser offenses or claiming self-defense. District Attorney Sarah Johnson held a press conference on Monday afternoon, standing behind a podium that felt like a judgment bench as she outlined the charges. The footage from Aaliyah's case had gone viral over the weekend, sparking national conversations about disability harassment, institutional complicity, and the courage required to fight back against systematic oppression. "The Commonwealth of Massachusetts takes disability-based harassment extremely seriously," DA Johnson announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the broader implications of this case. "When that harassment escalates to physical assault, we will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law." Brandon faced the most serious charges: conspiracy to commit assault, assault and battery, civil rights violations, and criminal harassment. His father's money had secured him the best legal representation available, but even high-powered attorneys couldn't argue with high-definition video evidence that showed him yanking a disabled student from her wheelchair. The civil rights charges were particularly devastating. Federal prosecutors had decided to make an example of the case, demonstrating that disability-based violence would be treated with the same seriousness as other hate crimes. The maximum sentence could include federal prison time that would effectively end any hope of the privileged future Brandon had always assumed was his birthright. Chase and Parker faced similar charges, though prosecutors had offered reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation and testimony about the pattern of harassment that had preceded the assault. Both families were reportedly considering the deals, recognizing that loyalty to Brandon wasn't worth destroying their own children's futures. But the criminal justice system was only the beginning of their accountability. Westfield Preparatory Academy faced its own crisis as news of the incident spread beyond local media. The school's carefully cultivated reputation for excellence was crumbling under scrutiny that revealed a pattern of administrative indifference to student harassment. Principal Davidson's resignation was announced on Tuesday morning, effective immediately. The school board statement was brief but telling. Mr. Davidson's leadership philosophy proved incompatible with our institutional commitment to student safety and dignity. Mrs. Chen was named interim principal within hours, her first act being the implementation of comprehensive anti-harassment policies that included mandatory reporting procedures and zero-tolerance enforcement. The policies were named the Thompson Protocols, in honor of the student whose courage had exposed the system's failures. The Federal Department of Education opened a formal investigation into Westfield's compliance with disability protection laws, threatening the school's accreditation and federal funding. The donors who'd protected Brandon's behavior found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from an institution that had become synonymous with privilege protecting predators. Civil lawsuits followed the criminal charges like aftershocks following an earthquake. The Thompson family's attorney, working pro bono for a case that had captured national attention, filed suit against the school, the three boys' families, and anyone else who'd contributed to the systematic harassment that had nearly destroyed Aaliyah's educational opportunity. The financial settlements were projected to reach 7 figures, money that would fund Aaliyah's college education and her mother's retirement from cleaning jobs that had subsidized other people's comfort for too long. But more important than the money was the precedent being set. Institutions could no longer hide behind bureaucratic inaction when students faced harassment. The three boys' futures were rewritten overnight. Brandon's acceptance to Harvard was revoked within a week, followed by rejections from every other university he'd applied to. College admissions offices had learned to check social media and criminal records, and his viral infamy had made him unemployable in the academic world he'd expected to dominate. Chase lost his lacrosse scholarship to Duke, while Parker watched his father's business face boycotts from clients who refused to associate with a family that had raised a child capable of such cruelty. The social media accounts that had once showcased their privilege now served as evidence in legal proceedings that would follow them for years. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the transformation of Aaliyah Thompson from victim to symbol. Speaking requests arrived daily from schools, organizations, and advocacy groups. Her story had become a rallying cry for anyone who'd ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. Justice, it turned out, was more than punishment for wrongdoing. It was the recognition that some people possessed strengths that couldn't be inherited, bought, or faked, and that those strengths, when finally revealed, could change everything. 6 months after the incident that had forever changed Westfield Preparatory Academy, the transformation was visible from the moment visitors stepped onto campus. The same marble hallways that had once echoed with privileged entitlement now hummed with a different energy, one of accountability, awareness, and genuine inclusion rather than tokenism disguised as diversity. Mrs. Chen's promotion from interim to permanent principal had been confirmed by a unanimous board vote, her first year marked by systematic changes that addressed not just the symptoms of institutional failure, but its root causes. The Thompson Protocols had become a model for prep schools across New England, mandatory training that taught students and faculty alike to recognize the difference between typical adolescent conflict and systematic harassment. The culture change has been remarkable, Mrs. Chen told the documentary crew that had come to film a follow-up story about the school's transformation. Students are more willing to report harassment, faculty are more vigilant about intervention, and most importantly, we've created an environment where dignity isn't negotiable. The physical changes were subtle but significant. Accessibility features that had once been afterthoughts were now seamlessly integrated into the campus design. The ramps Aaliyah had navigated with quiet dignity were no longer the only accommodations available. Elevators had been upgraded, bathrooms redesigned, and pathways expanded to ensure that mobility was never a barrier to full participation in school life. More importantly, the social changes ran deeper than architecture. A new student advocacy program, inspired directly by Aaliyah's experience, provided trained peer counselors and faculty mentors for anyone facing harassment or discrimination. The program was voluntary but widely used, creating a network of support that extended far beyond traditional administrative channels. The academic impact was equally profound. A new required course, Ethics and Social Responsibility, used case studies from the Thompson incident to teach students about the real-world consequences of their choices. The curriculum was designed by Dr. Martinez, Jessica's mother, whose expertise in neurology brought scientific rigor to discussions about disability, recovery, and the danger of assumptions. The goal isn't to shame students for past ignorance, Dr. Martinez explained to a group of visiting educators. The goal is to create informed citizens who understand that privilege comes with responsibility and that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances. The student body had evolved as well. Aaliyah's courage had inspired others to speak up about their own experiences with harassment, discrimination, and abuse. What had begun as one girl's refusal to accept injustice had sparked a movement that transformed how students related to each other and to authority. Jessica Martinez, now student body president, had channeled her artistic talents into creating a mural that dominated the main lobby, a visual representation of strength emerging from struggle, of individuals supporting each other, of community rising above individual ambition. At its center was a figure that unmistakably represented Aaliyah, standing tall with quiet dignity. "She showed us that being strong doesn't mean being silent," Jessica said during her inaugural address. "It means knowing when silence serves justice and when speaking up changes everything." The ripple effects extended far beyond Westfield's campus. The Thompson case had become required reading in education policy courses, a cautionary tale about institutional complacency and an inspiring example of individual courage creating systematic change. Disability rights organizations had adopted Aaliyah's story as a symbol of empowerment, while legal scholars studied the case as a model for effective prosecution of harassment crimes. Other schools began implementing their own versions of the Thompson protocols, recognizing that the factors that had enabled Brandon's behavior, administrative indifference, donor influence overriding student welfare, the assumption that privilege provided immunity from consequences, existed in educational institutions across the country. The federal investigation had concluded with new guidelines for reporting and addressing disability-based harassment, regulations that carried the force of law and the threat of losing federal funding for institutions that failed to comply. Aaliyah's 8 months of patient endurance had resulted in protections that would benefit students for generations. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. At Westfield Preparatory Academy, every student now understood that belonging wasn't something you inherited or purchased. It was something you earned through how you treated others, especially those who couldn't immediately defend themselves. The girl who'd been told she didn't belong had rewritten the rules of belonging for everyone. 2 years later, Aaliyah Thompson stood at the podium of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., preparing to address the National Conference on Disability Rights. The same girl who'd once navigated Westfield's hallways in silence now commanded the attention of legislators, advocates, and educators from across the country. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone who'd transformed personal suffering into systemic change. "The most dangerous misconception about strength," she began, her words echoing through the packed auditorium, "is that it should be immediately visible. That real power announces itself, that true capability demands constant demonstration. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait. Wait for the right moment. Wait for the perfect opportunity. Wait for your opponents to reveal exactly who they are." In the audience, her parents sat in the front row. Miguel Thompson, finally home from deployment, wore his dress uniform with pride that had nothing to do with military rank and everything to do with watching his daughter command a room full of the nation's most powerful advocates. Carmen Thompson, no longer cleaning anyone else's floors, had started her own cleaning service, one that specialized in training and employing formerly marginalized workers at living wages. The scholarship offers had been overwhelming. Harvard, MIT, Stanford, every institution that had once seemed impossibly out of reach, was now competing for the honor of educating the girl whose story had sparked a national conversation about courage, dignity, and the power of fighting back intelligently. "I chose MIT," Aaliyah continued, "not because it was the most prestigious offer, but because they understood something fundamental. Accessibility isn't charity, it's justice. When institutions make space for everyone to succeed, they don't lower their standards. They expand their definition of excellence. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. In the crowd, Aaliyah spotted faces she recognized. Mrs. Chen, who'd traveled from Boston to witness this moment. Jessica Martinez, now a sophomore at Columbia studying journalism and documenting stories of institutional change. Dr. Martinez, whose work on the Thompson Protocols had earned her national recognition in educational reform. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was Sensei Richardson, who'd flown in from Massachusetts to see his former student address the nation. Their eyes met across the crowded auditorium, and he offered the small bow of respect that passed between martial artists who understood that true strength was measured not in victories won, but in how those victories were used. "The boys who attacked me," Aaliyah said as the applause subsided, "thought they were teaching me a lesson about power. They thought they were showing me my place in a hierarchy they'd never questioned. What they actually did was teach me that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to be broken by it." She paused, her eyes finding the camera that was broadcasting her speech to millions of viewers worldwide. Students facing harassment, parents fighting institutional indifference, advocates working to create change one policy at a time. To everyone watching who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever been targeted for being different, who's ever been underestimated because of circumstances beyond their control, remember this: your opponent's biggest weakness is often their certainty that you'll never fight back. And when you finally do, when you stand up with all the strength you've been quietly building, when you prove that dignity can't be taken, only given away, that's when everything changes. The final applause was thunderous, but Aaliyah barely heard it. She was thinking about a scared 16-year-old girl rolling through marble hallways, absorbing cruelty and storing strength for a moment that seemed impossibly far away. She was thinking about her father's voice on crackling phone calls. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to act. The right moment had arrived 2 years ago in a prep school gymnasium. But the impact of that moment, the lives changed, the policies reformed, the countless students who would never face what she'd endured, that legacy would last forever. After the conference, as Aaliyah made her way through the crowd of admirers and advocates, her phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was unexpected. Marcus Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, now a freshman at Westfield Preparatory Academy. "Wanted you to know, things are different here now, really different. Nobody gets away with anything anymore. Thank you for making it safe for the rest of us." Aaliyah smiled, pocketing the phone as she joined her parents for the reception. Change, she'd learned, wasn't just about the dramatic moments that made headlines. It was about the quiet transformations that followed, the students who felt safe to be themselves, the institutions that remembered their responsibility to protect rather than enable, the communities that chose dignity over hierarchy. 3 months later, she would start at MIT with a full scholarship and a dorm room that had been designed with universal accessibility principles. She would study computer science and neurobiology, drawn to research that might help other spinal injury patients recover more completely. She would continue speaking at conferences, sharing her story with audiences who needed to hear that strength could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. But on this night, as she stood in the Kennedy Center surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her courage, Aaliyah Thompson allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The girl who'd been told she didn't belong had created belonging for countless others. The victim who'd been dismissed as charity had become a symbol of justice. The warrior who'd been underestimated had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the refusal to accept that things will never change. Brandon Mitchell, Chase Worthington, and Parker Hayes had taught her many things during those months of harassment. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: when you assume your victims will stay victims forever, you inevitably create the very conditions that transform them into warriors. And warriors, once awakened, have a tendency to change the world. If this story inspired you, please like this video to help it reach others who might need to hear Aaliyah's message. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage overcoming cruelty, and hit the notification bell so you never miss these tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next incredible story.